Chapter 1. The Light That Binds. There are no forces in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium more vital to the survival of mankind than the Astronomican, the psychic beacon that blazes from Terra across 70,000 light-years of void, a star among stars that burns not with nuclear fire, but with the very soul of the Emperor himself. For 10,000 years it has never wavered. For 10,000 years it has never dimmed. Yet on this day, in the span of 30 heartbeats, that eternal light would vanish completely. The navigator, Lucinda Valerian, first felt the wrongness, as her ship, the Imperial frigate Undaunted Faith, translated from the warp near the Cadian Gate. The third eye upon her forehead, that cursed gift that marked her lineage and purpose, had been fixed upon the Astronomican's golden radiance when the light simply ceased to be. Not dimmed, not flickered. Gone, as if the Emperor himself had drawn his final breath, in that moment of absolute darkness, 30 seconds that stretched like an eternity. Every navigator in the Imperium experienced the same terrible revelation. They heard him scream. It was not a sound that travelled through the void or echoed in the chambers of their ships. It was a psychic shriek of such magnitude that it bypassed the ears entirely and carved itself directly into the soul. The sound of a god in agony, of the master of mankind, pushed beyond all endurance, of 10,000 years of sacrifice crystallizing into one moment of perfect, unbearable pain. Lucinda collapsed to her knees in the navigation chamber, blood streaming from her third eye as the scream reverberated through her mind. Around her, the ship's crew continued their duties, unaware that anything had changed. They could not see what she saw, could not hear what she heard. The mundane humans went about their work while their navigator writhed on the deck, clutching her head as the Emperor's anguish tore through her consciousness like broken glass. Across the galaxy, her kindred suffered the same fate. Navigator House Belisarius on Hydra 4, their ancient patriarch Cornelius, collapsed during a formal reception, his augmetic third eye sparking and bleeding as the scream hit him. The younger navigators of House Nostromo, guiding a supply convoy through the Maelstrom's edge, cried out in unison as their ships were forced to emergency translate back to real space, their pilots unable to maintain focus through the psychic storm. On Terra itself, in the Navi's Nobility Palace that stood in the shadow of the Golden Throne, every navigator felt the scream with particular intensity. They were closest to its source, closest to the Emperor's suffering, and the proximity nearly shattered their minds. Navigator Prime, Tobias Maxilla, ancient beyond measure and scarred by centuries of warp travel, fell from his throne in the high chamber. His voice, when he could finally speak, was barely a whisper. He is dying. The master of mankind is dying, and he wants us to know. Yet even as the navigators across the Imperium reeled from the Emperor's psychic scream, the Astronomican blazed back to life, 30 seconds of darkness, and then the beacon resumed its eternal vigil as if nothing had occurred. The golden radiance flowed across the galaxy once more, steady and unwavering, offering no explanation for its momentary absence. But the damage was done. Every navigator who had heard that scream understood that something fundamental had changed. The Emperor's silence, his stoic endurance of 10 millennia upon the Golden Throne, had been broken. For 30 seconds, he had allowed his agony to escape, had permitted his children of the warp to know the true cost of their salvation. Lucinda pulled herself to her feet, her hands still trembling as she wiped the blood from her face. The Undaunted Faith continued on its course toward Cadia, its captain unaware that his navigator had just witnessed something that would reshape the Imperium's understanding of their god-emperor's sacrifice. She could feel the Astronomican's light once more, could navigate by its familiar radiance. but she would never again look upon it without remembering the sound of his pain. In the depths of the imperial palace, 10,000 psychers continued their daily sacrifice to fuel the golden throne. The emperor sat motionless upon his prison of golden machinery, his mouth frozen in that eternal silent scream. But for 30 seconds, that scream had not been silent. For 30 seconds, every navigator in the Imperium had heard the voice of a dying god. The question that would haunt them all was simple. Why had he chosen to let them hear? What message lay hidden in that moment of revealed agony? And most terrifying of all, what had driven the master of mankind to break his own silence after 10,000 years of stoic endurance? The Astronomican blazed on, steady and eternal, but its light would never feel the same to those who had heard their emperor scream in the darkness. The beacon that had guided humanity through the warp for millennia now carried with it a terrible knowledge. The God who sustained them was not beyond suffering. He was drowning in it, and he wanted his children to know. Chapter 2. The Ripple Effect. The news reached High Lord Navigator Phenonites within the hour, carried not by Vox transmission, but by the trembling hands of his own navigators as they stumbled into his sanctum aboard the flagship Eternal Vigil. The ancient man, whose third eye had guided imperial fleets for 3 centuries, listened to their stammered reports with growing dread. Every ship in his battle group had experienced the same phenomenon. 30 seconds of darkness, 30 seconds of the Emperor's agony made manifest. Yet it was not merely the navigator houses that felt the tremors of this unprecedented event. Across the segmentum solar, astropaths began reporting disturbing anomalies in the psychic sphere. The soul bond that connected them to the Emperor, that allowed them to send messages across the void through his divine will, had fluctuated during those same 30 seconds. Some spoke of feeling a presence so vast and tortured that it had nearly torn their minds apart. Others described a moment of perfect clarity, as if the Emperor's attention had suddenly focused upon them with the intensity of a star. On Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus registered the anomaly through their most sensitive auger arrays. Tech Dominus Zerath 9, his mind more machine than flesh after 6 centuries of modifications, processed the data with cold precision. The Astronomican's output had not simply ceased during those 30 seconds. It had inverted, becoming a negative beacon that drew energy inward rather than projecting it outward. The implications were staggering, yet Zerath 9's emotion dampeners prevented the full impact of terror from reaching his consciousness. The first casualties were already mounting. 3 Imperial Navy vessels had been caught mid-translation through the warp when the beacon failed, their navigators temporarily blinded by the darkness and the Emperor's scream. The frigate Deliverance's Hope had emerged in the void between systems, its navigator permanently damaged, his third eye weeping tears of silver that would never cease. The strike cruiser Emperor's Fist had fared worse, appearing inside the gravity well of a dead star, its hull already buckling under forces that should have been impossible to survive. But it was the psychological impact that proved most devastating. Navigator houses across the Imperium began reporting the same phenomenon. Their members were refusing to enter the warp. The terror of hearing the Emperor's agony had shattered something fundamental in the navigator gene lines, creating a paralysis that threatened to cripple interstellar commerce and military operations. Ships sat in dock, their captains pleading with traumatized navigators who could no longer bear to open their third eyes to the light of the Astronomican. Lord Commander Dante of the Blood Angels felt the crisis reach his chapter within days. His navigator, Matthias Kryn of House Belisarius, had guided the Red Tear through countless campaigns across 9 millennia. Yet when Dante ordered the battle barge to translate to the Baal system for resupply, Kryn had collapsed in his navigation chamber, muttering prayers to the Emperor and begging forgiveness for sins he could not name. "My lord," Kryn whispered, his noble bearing broken by terror, "I cannot unsee what I witnessed. The master of mankind. His pain is beyond mortal comprehension. How can we ask him to endure such torment for our convenience? Dante, ancient beyond measure, even by Space Marine standards, had weathered 10,000 years of war and hardship. Yet the sight of his navigator's breakdown filled him with a dread he had not felt since the darkest days of the Tyrannid invasions. If the navigators could no longer function, the Imperium would fragment into isolated systems, each world left to face the darkness alone. On Terra itself, the situation grew more desperate by the hour. Navigator Prime Tobias Maxilla had not spoken since his collapse in the High Chamber, his mind apparently locked in communion with something beyond mortal understanding. The lesser navigators of the Navi's Nobility Palace fared little better, many refusing to leave their chambers or speak of what they had experienced. Those who did manage to function described the same horrifying revelation. The Emperor's scream had contained more than just pain. It had carried knowledge, terrible and absolute, of what was coming. Inquisitor Vex Korath of the Ordo Malleus arrived at the palace within the day, her authority superseding even that of the navigator houses when matters of imperial security were at stake. She found the great halls of the Navis Nobilitae transformed from centers of power into asylums for the psychically traumatized. Navigators who had guided fleets through the Eye of Terror now cowered in corners, their third eyes sealed shut with blessed wax, and their minds shattered by 30 seconds of divine anguish. "What did you see?" Korath demanded of one of the younger navigators, a scion of House Nostromo, whose sanity seemed the most intact. What knowledge did the Emperor impart in his moment of weakness? The navigator, barely old enough to have received his first third eye grafts, looked up at her with eyes that held the weight of eternity. "Not weakness, Inquisitor. Warning. The Emperor did not lose control of his pain. He chose to share it. He wanted us to know what is coming, and he wanted us to prepare." Prepare for what? The end of everything we have built. The final test of mankind's worthiness to survive. The moment when even the master of mankind's sacrifice may not be enough to save us. Korath felt ice spread through her veins. In her centuries of service to the Inquisition, she had faced demons, heretics, and Xenos threats that would have driven lesser minds to madness. Yet the certainty in this young navigator's voice carried a weight that surpassed all those horrors. This was not the raving of a broken mind, but the testimony of someone who had received revelation from the highest source imaginable. The Astronomican continued to blaze across the galaxy, steady and unwavering, as if nothing had changed. But beneath that familiar light, the Imperium trembled with the knowledge that their God-Emperor had chosen to share his agony for a reason. The question that haunted every navigator, every astropath, and every soul who served the throne was simple. What darkness approached that would drive even the Emperor to break his eternal silence? The beacon that had guided humanity for 10 millennia still burned bright. But now it carried with it the echo of divine suffering and the terrible certainty that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The first conclave of navigator houses in 3 centuries convened within the Crystal Chamber beneath the Navi's Nobility Palace on Terra. Representatives from every major house across the Segmentum Solar had answered the summons, their faces bearing the same haunted expression that had marked their kindred since the Emperor's scream. High Navigator Patriarch Cornelius of House Belisarius, his augmetic third eye still sparking from the psychic trauma, called the assembly to order, with a voice that carried the weight of 10 millennia of service. "We face a crisis unlike any in our recorded history," he began, his words echoing in the vast chamber where crystal formations amplified psychic resonance. "Our gene gift, blessed by the Emperor's own hand, has become our curse. Yet we cannot abandon our duty to the throne, no matter the cost to our sanity." The assembled navigators stirred uneasily. Many bore visible signs of their trauma, silver tears that would not cease, third eyes bound with blessed cloth, or the telltale tremor of those who had glimpsed something beyond mortal comprehension. House Nostromo's representative, Matriarch Eleanor, spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. The young navigator, captured by the Inquisition, spoke truth. The master of mankind didn't lose control. He chose to share his burden with us. But why us? Why reveal such agony to those who must continue to serve? The answer came not from the assembled navigators, but from an unexpected source. Captain General Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes stepped from the shadows at the chamber's edge, his presence immediately commanding absolute attention. The Golden Giant had not spoken at a navigator conclave in living memory, yet his appearance here confirmed what many had feared. This crisis reached to the very heart of the Imperial Palace. "Because you alone can see what approaches," Valoris said, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke for the Emperor himself. "Your third eyes perceive more than the light of the Astronomican. They see the currents of the warp itself, the ebb and flow of psychic energy across the galaxy, and in those currents, something vast stirs in the darkness beyond the galactic rim." The chamber fell silent, save for the soft chiming of crystal formations resonating with suppressed terror. Valoris continued, his golden armor gleaming in the chamber's ethereal light. 3 days ago, our deepest auger arrays detected gravitational anomalies in the void beyond Segmentum Ultima. Something massive enough to bend spacetime approaches from the intergalactic darkness. The Astronomican's momentary failure was not random timing. It was synchronized with the first detection of this presence. Navigator Lucinda Valerian, summoned from the Cadian Gate to attend the conclave, found her voice, despite the fear that gripped her throat. "Captain General, what manner of threat could warrant such desperate warning from the Master himself?" Valoris turned his ancient gaze upon her, and she glimpsed something in those eyes that chilled her to the bone. Fear. Not the cautious wariness of a warrior facing known danger, but the primal terror of one who had seen the abyss and found it looking back. "We believe it to be a Tyranid hive fleet," he said, the words falling like hammer blows in the silent chamber. "But not like any previously encountered. This fleet is ancient beyond measure, predating even the hive fleets that have terrorized our galaxy. It is the origin swarm, the first and greatest of its kind, returning to consume what it seeded long ago." The implications struck the assembled navigators like a physical blow. The Tyranid hive fleets that had already ravaged entire sectors were mere splinter forces, scouts and foragers compared to what now approached. If Valoris spoke truth, then humanity faced not just another alien invasion, but the arrival of a power that could devour the galaxy entire. Patriarch Cornelius raised a trembling hand. How do we guide ships through the warp when the mere thought of our duty fills us with the Emperor's own agony? "You adapt," came a new voice from the chamber's entrance. Tech Dominus Xerath 9 of Mars entered with measured steps, his mechanical form a stark contrast to the organic terror that permeated the gathering. "The flesh may weaken, but the machine endures. We propose a synthesis." The Tech Dominus gestured, and servo skulls projected holographic schematics into the chamber's center. The assembled navigators stared at designs for neural dampeners, psychic buffers, and mechanical third eyes that could filter the Astronomican's light without exposing the navigator's mind to its full psychic weight. These modifications will allow your kind to function despite the trauma, Zerath 9 explained, his vox-grilled voice devoid of emotion. The price is a reduction in navigational precision and the permanent alteration of your gene gift. But it will preserve the Imperium's ability to wage war across the stars. The chamber erupted in angry voices. The Navigator houses had spent millennia preserving the purity of their bloodlines, their third eyes, sacred gifts, passed down through generations of service to the throne. The suggestion of mechanical augmentation was tantamount to heresy in their ancient traditions. Yet as the debate raged, Navigator Lucinda felt the truth settling into her bones like ice. The Emperor had not shared his agony out of weakness or accident. He had given them a choice: endure the pain and continue to serve, or find another way to fulfill their duty to humanity. The approaching darkness would not wait for their trauma to heal or their traditions to adapt. Captain General Valoris raised his guardian spear, and silence fell instantly. The decision is yours to make, but make it swiftly. Our astropath networks report increasing warp turbulence in the void between galaxies. Whatever approaches draws closer with each passing day. The Emperor's warning was not just about what is coming, but when it will arrive. "How long do we have?" Matriarch Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "At current velocity, accounting for the distortions in space-time caused by its passage, perhaps 6 months, maybe less if it accelerates." Valoris paused, letting the weight of that time frame settle upon the assembly. 6 months to prepare for a war that will determine whether humanity survives or joins the countless species this ancient swarm has already consumed. The crystal formations chimed softly in the aftermath of his words, their resonance carrying undertones of finality. The navigators faced a choice that would reshape their ancient houses forever. Preserve their traditions and risk the paralysis that gripped their kind, or embrace augmentation and sacrifice their purity for the greater survival of the species they served. In the depths of the imperial palace, the Emperor sat motionless upon the golden throne, his consciousness focused not on the debate taking place far below, but on the darkness between the stars. Through instruments of science and sorcery, he watched the approach of something he had hoped would never return. The Tyrannid Origin fleet, the first and mightiest of the great Devourer's children, had followed the psychic beacon of the Astronomican across the void between galaxies. And now, after eons of wandering the cosmic dark, it was coming home to finish what it had started billions of years before. The Emperor's scream had been more than warning. It had been the sound of a god realizing that even his sacrifice might not be enough to save the species he had given everything to protect. Chapter 4. The Price of Salvation. The vote split the Navigator houses down bloodlines that had remained united for millennia. House Belisarius, with their long tradition of service to the Imperial Navy, cast their lot with augmentation. House Nostromo, keepers of the purest Navigator gene seed, stood in fierce opposition. The ancient rivalries that had simmered beneath centuries of cooperation now burst into open conflict as the very soul of the Navis Nobilite hung in the balance. Navigator Lucinda Valerian found herself caught between worlds as she stood in the augmentation chamber beneath the Martian forge temple of Tech Dominus Zerath 9. The mechanical third eye, crafted from blessed adamantium and psychoconductive crystals, lay gleaming on the surgical altar before her. She had volunteered to be among the first, driven not by ambition, but by the haunting memory of ships lost in the void, because their navigators could no longer function. "The process will permanently alter your perception of the warp," Zerath 9 explained, his multiple servo arms preparing the delicate instruments. "You will never again see the Astronomican as your ancestors did. The mechanical augmentation will filter the Emperor's light through blessed machinery. dulling both its glory and its pain. Lucinda nodded, though her hands trembled as she lay upon the cold metal surface. Around the chamber, tech adepts chanted binary prayers, while incense burners filled the air with sacred oils. The fusion of flesh and machine had always been the Mechanicus way, but for a navigator to undergo such modification was unprecedented. The surgery began at the hour of midnight, Terra time, when the Astronomican's light was traditionally at its strongest, as Zerath 9's precision instruments removed her organic third eye. Lucinda felt a profound loss that went beyond physical amputation. The gift that had marked her bloodline for 10,000 years was being sacrificed for the survival of humanity itself. Yet as the mechanical replacement interfaced with her nervous system, something unexpected occurred. The Emperor's anguish, which had paralyzed her since that terrible moment 30 days ago, began to fade. In its place came a new kind of sight, one that perceived the warp's currents with crystalline clarity, but without the overwhelming emotional weight that had crippled her kindred. "Fascinating," Zerath 9 murmured, as Lucinda's vital signs stabilized. The mechanical third eye does not simply filter the Astronomican's light. It translates psychic energy into data patterns, allowing cognition without spiritual contamination. 3 decks below, the first protests had already begun. Navigator Matthias Kryn of House Belisarius, the same man who had broken down before Lord Commander Dante, led a group of traditionalists in desperate prayer. They had barricaded themselves in the chapel of St. Euphrati-Kila, refusing to submit to what they termed the desecration of the Emperor's gift. "We are his chosen," Kryn declared to the assembled crowd, his noble bearing restored by righteous fury. "Our third eyes are blessed by his own touch, marked by his divine essence. To replace them with cold machinery is to reject his love and embrace the false promises of Mars." The schism deepened as word of the augmentation program spread beyond Terra. On Hydrafor, Navigator House Belisarius began converting their younger members to the mechanical third eyes, while their elders maintained traditional sight. The result was a generation divided against itself, with augmented navigators guiding ships through the warp, while their unmodified kin remained grounded by trauma and fear. High Admiral Spire of Battlefleet Gothic faced the consequences directly when half his navigator corps refused augmentation, while the other half embraced it. His fleet, crucial for defending the Segmentum Obscurus against potential Tyranid advance scouts, found itself paralyzed by internal conflict. Augmented navigators could function, but lacked the precision of their traditional counterparts, while unmodified navigators possessed superior skill, but could not overcome their psychological barriers. "This madness will fracture the Imperium before the Xenos even arrive," Spire confided to his flag captain as they watched protests spread through the naval port of Bacca. "We face a choice between imperfect servants and no servants at all." The solution came from an unexpected source. Sister Superior Palatine Johanna of the Order of Our Martyred Lady had been present when the Emperor's scream echoed through the warp. Though not a navigator herself, her psychic sensitivity had allowed her to perceive the edges of his message. She requested an audience with the divided navigator houses, bringing with her a revelation that would reshape their understanding of their crisis. "The Emperor's pain was not random," she declared before the assembled representatives in the crystal chamber. "It contained specific images, visions of what approaches us from beyond the rim. I have meditated upon these visions for 30 days, and the truth is clear. The ancient Tyranid fleet carries with it something that can corrupt psychic sight itself." The chamber fell silent as her words sank in. Palatine Johanna continued, her voice carrying the certainty of divine revelation. "The creatures within that fleet have evolved beyond mere physical consumption. They feed upon psychic energy itself, and their approach has already begun to poison the currents of the warp. The Emperor's scream was not just warning us of their coming, but preparing our minds for contact with something that can turn our greatest gift into our greatest weakness." Navigator Patriarch Cornelius leaned forward, his augmetic third eye focusing on the sister with mechanical precision. You suggest that our traditional sight would be more vulnerable to this corruption? I suggest that the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, guided Mars to develop augmentation precisely because he foresaw this need. The mechanical third eyes do not just filter his pain, they protect against the psychic predation that approaches with the Origin fleet. The revelation struck like lightning through the assembled navigators. If Palatine Johanna spoke truth, then the choice between tradition and augmentation was no choice at all. It was the difference between serving the Emperor's will and falling victim to Xenos corruption. Yet even as understanding dawned, resistance remained. Navigator House Nostromo's matriarch, Eleanor, stood in defiant opposition, her voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. Even if this sister speaks truth, we cannot simply abandon 10 millennia of sacred heritage. Our bloodlines have served the throne since before the heresy itself. To modify our gift is to admit that the Emperor's original design was flawed. The debate might have continued for days, but it was interrupted by urgent Vox transmissions from the outer system. The first refugee ships had begun arriving at Terra, their holds filled with survivors from the furthest reaches of Segmentum Ultima. Their reports painted a picture of Terra that silenced all theological arguments. The approaching Tyranid fleet had begun sending psychic emanations ahead of its physical presence. Worlds with strong navigator populations were experiencing mass psychosis, with entire bloodlines falling into catatonic states, or worse. Some navigators had turned violent, their third eyes weeping blood as they spoke of visions that drove listeners to madness. As the reports poured in, even the most traditionalist navigator houses began to understand the true nature of their choice. This was not about preserving ancient ways or embracing technological augmentation. This was about survival against a threat that could turn their greatest strength into a weapon of self-destruction. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor continued his vigil upon the Golden Throne, his consciousness stretched across the galaxy as he monitored the approach of the ancient enemy. The mechanical augmentations were proceeding as he had foreseen, each modified navigator becoming a shield against the psychic corruption that preceded the Origin fleet's arrival. Yet even his divine wisdom could not guarantee success. The approaching swarm was older and more cunning than any Tyranid force previously encountered. It had learned from eons of consumption, evolving strategies to turn humanity's psychic gifts against itself. The augmentations would provide protection, but the ultimate battle would be fought not in the void between stars, but in the realm of the human soul itself. Chapter 5. The Shadow Falls. The refugee ship Eternal Sorrow, translated into the Sol system, with emergency klaxons blazing, and its navigator's chamber sealed with blessed lead. Captain Mordian Vex, veteran of 100 campaigns, had never seen his crew so shaken. They had fled from the edge of Segmentum Ultima, carrying survivors from 12 worlds, but their cargo of human misery was nothing compared to the horror their navigator had witnessed in the depths of the warp. Navigator Cassius of House Ortelius had been among the finest of his generation, his third eye capable of perceiving warp currents with unprecedented clarity. Yet when Captain Vex found him in his sanctum, the proud scion of an ancient bloodline had been reduced to a gibbering wreck, his organic third eye weeping tears of silver while he spoke of things that should not exist. "They sing," Cassius whispered through cracked lips, his hands trembling as servitors restrained him. The stars themselves sing their hunger, and the song grows louder with each passing day. I have seen the edge of their shadow in the warp, Captain. It stretches across light years, and where it passes, the very fabric of reality grows thin. High Lord Militant Constantin Valdor received the report within hours, his ancient features growing grave as he processed the implications. The Tyranid Origin fleet was no longer a distant threat approaching from beyond the rim. Its psychic emanations had begun to poison the warp itself, creating a bow wave of corruption that preceded the physical arrival of the swarm by months. On Mars, Tech Dominus Izerath 9 worked without rest to mass-produce the mechanical third eyes that might save the Navigator houses from psychic contamination. His forged temples had been converted to emergency production facilities, with entire cohorts of tech adepts laboring around the sacred machines. Yet for every Navigator who accepted augmentation, 3 more fell victim to the approaching psychic storm. The casualties were mounting across the galaxy's eastern edge. Navigator House Pythos, guardians of the Maelstrom shipping routes, had lost half their membership to madness within a single week. House Raven, whose bloodline had guided explorator fleets into the unknown for millennia, reported that their younger members were experiencing prophetic visions of cities made from living bone and oceans of digestive acid that stretched beyond the horizon. Inquisitor Vex Korath found herself struggling to contain information that could shatter Imperial morale if it reached the general population. The refugee ships brought not just reports of distant horror, but evidence of something far worse. The Tyranid influence was already beginning to affect human populations on worlds that had never seen the alien swarm. "The psychic contamination spreads like a plague," she reported to the High Lords of Terror during an emergency conclave. Planets with strong psyker populations are experiencing mass hysteria, spontaneous mutations, and in some cases, entire hive cities turning on themselves in cannibalistic frenzy. The Xenos fleet need not land to begin its consumption. It feeds on fear itself. Lord Commander Guilliman, returned from his campaigns in the Dark Imperium, stood before the assembled lords with the weight of Primarch authority. His pale features bore the strain of coordinating a defense against something that defied conventional military strategy. "We cannot fight an enemy that corrupts minds before it arrives," he declared, his voice carrying across the chamber. "Our greatest strength has always been the unity of human purpose. If the approaching swarm can turn that strength against itself, we face defeat before the first shot is fired." The solution, when it came, arose from the most unexpected source. Navigator Lucinda Valerian, now bearing her mechanical third eye with growing confidence, requested an audience with the High Lords. She had spent weeks testing the limits of her augmented sight, and what she had discovered offered both hope and terror in equal measure. "The mechanical third eyes do more than protect us from psychic corruption," she explained, her augmetic implant glowing with soft blue light. "They allow us to perceive the warp without emotional contamination, to see the approaching threat as data rather than existential horror. And in that clarity, I have glimpsed something the organic sight cannot perceive." She gestured, and servo skulls projected holographic star charts into the chamber's center. The assembled lords stared at patterns of light and shadow that seemed to writhe with malevolent purpose. "The Origin fleet moves within a psychic storm of its own creation, but at its heart lies something ancient and artificial. The swarm is not merely following instinct or hunger. It is being guided by an intelligence that has learned from every species it has consumed across eons of wandering between galaxies." Guilliman leaned forward, his Primarch senses focusing on the implications. "You speak of a hive mind, but something more than the typical Tyranid overmind. I speak of a consciousness that has devoured entire galactic civilizations," Lucinda replied, her mechanical third eye pulsing with increasing intensity. "It carries within itself the collective knowledge and hatred of every species the Tyranids have ever consumed, and it remembers humanity from their last visit to this galaxy, long before the rise of the Imperium." The revelation struck the assembly like a physical blow. The Tyranids had been to their galaxy before, in ages so distant that no human record remained. The Origin fleet was not an invasion, but a homecoming, and it carried with it the grudges of species that had fought and lost against humanity's ancestors in forgotten wars. As if summoned by the growing dread in the chamber, Captain General Valoris appeared at Guilliman's side. The Golden Giant's presence commanded immediate attention, and his words carried the authority of one who spoke from the throne room itself. "The Emperor stirs," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper, yet audible to every soul present. For the first time since his entombment, the master of mankind shows signs of consciousness beyond mere survival. He has been communicating through the Astronomican's fluctuations. The High Lords exchanged glances of mixed hope and terror. If the Emperor was awakening from his 10,000-year vigil, it could mean salvation for humanity, but it might also herald the final crisis that would demand even his ultimate sacrifice. "What does he communicate?" Lord Castellan Creed asked, his veteran's voice steady, despite the implications. Valoris paused, as if weighing the wisdom of his next words. "Patterns, battle formations from wars fought before human civilization began. Weapon schematics for devices that predate even the dark age of technology. And coordinates for something hidden within the solar system itself, something that has waited in darkness since before terror knew the touch of human footsteps." The chamber fell silent as the magnitude of these revelations settled upon the assembled lords. The approaching Tyrannid Origin fleet was not just another Xenos threat, but the return of an ancient enemy that remembered humanity from their species' earliest days. And the Emperor, stirring from his deathless slumber, was preparing weapons and strategies from wars lost to history. High Admiral Spire of Battlefleet. Gothic broke the silence with a question that echoed the fears of every military commander present. "How do we fight something that has already defeated us once before?" The answer came not from the High Lords, but from Navigator Lucinda, her augmented sight piercing veils of time that human consciousness had never been meant to penetrate. "We do not fight as we did before," she said, her mechanical third eye blazing with inner light. "The Emperor's awakening consciousness is not random. He remembers the First War, the weapons that failed, the strategies that crumbled before the Great Devourer's hunger. This time, he intends to win." In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient mechanisms that had slumbered since the birth of the Imperium began to activate. The Emperor's will, channeled through the Golden Throne's reality-shaping technologies, reached into sealed chambers where weapons from humanity's forgotten Golden Age waited in eternal readiness. The shadow of the Origin fleet continued to spread across the galaxy's eastern reaches, but for the first time since the crisis began, humanity would not face it as victims. They would meet their ancient enemy as the Emperor had always intended, as the inheritors of technologies and strategies forged in the crucible of humanity's first and most terrible war. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 6. Echoes of the First War. The coordinates led them to Pluto's shadow, where no human vessel had reason to venture in 10,000 years. Captain General Valoris himself led the expedition aboard the custodian dreadnought Auric Hammer, accompanied by Tech Dominus Zerath, 9 and a carefully selected team of Mechanicus Archaeotech specialists. What they discovered in the ice-locked vaults beneath the dwarf planet's surface would reshape their understanding of humanity's origins. The chamber stretched beyond the reach of their illuminators, its walls covered in geometric patterns that hurt the mind to perceive directly. At its heart lay machines of impossible complexity, their surfaces bearing the hallmarks of pre-imperial craftsmanship, yet incorporating technologies that surpassed even the Mechanicus's most sacred knowledge. The air itself hummed with barely contained power, as if the entire structure existed in a state of perpetual readiness. "These patterns," Tech Dominus Xerath 9 whispered, his multiple optical arrays scanning the alien geometries. "They are not human in origin, yet they have been adapted by human hands. The fusion is seamless, suggesting cooperation rather than conquest." Valoris approached the central device, a crystalline construct that pulsed with inner light in rhythm with the distant Astronomican. As his gauntleted hand touched its surface, the machine responded with a flood of data that bypassed his consciousness and spoke directly to his gene-crafted soul. Images of a war fought across eons flooded his mind, showing humanity as it had never existed in recorded history. They had been star gods once, these ancient humans. not through conquest or technological supremacy, but through alliance with beings whose names had been lost to time. The crystal revealed fragments of that forgotten age, cities that spanned solar systems, weapons that could reshape reality itself, and a civilization that had stood as guardians against the darkness between galaxies. The Tyranids had come before, in that distant golden age when humanity's reach extended beyond the Milky Way into neighboring galaxies. The First War had lasted 1,000,000 years, fought with weapons that made the Imperium's greatest arsenals seem like primitive clubs. Yet for all their power, that ancient humanity had fallen, not to the great devourer's physical might, but to a more insidious corruption. The psychic contamination, Valoris breathed, understanding flooding through him as the crystal's memories continued to unfold. They turned our greatest strength against us then as well. Our alliance with the Old Ones, our mastery of the warp itself, became the vector through which they destroyed us. The images showed the final days of that first civilization. Star gods reduced to desperate survivors, their alien allies consumed or fled, their great works crumbling as the Tyranid origin fleet swept across galaxy after galaxy. Yet in the final moments, a handful of survivors had made a choice that would echo across millions of years. They had seeded the galaxy with hidden weapons, technologies so advanced they could only be activated by their genetic inheritors. More importantly, they had ensured that one among their number would survive to guide those inheritors when the ancient enemy returned. The Emperor of Mankind was not just humanity's greatest leader. He was the last survivor of that first war, preserved across eons to prepare for this moment of reckoning. On Terra, the Golden Throne began to emit harmonics that had never been recorded in its 10,000-year operation. The Emperor's consciousness, stirred by the activation of the Plutonian Vault, was expanding beyond the simple maintenance of the Astronomican. For the first time since his entombment, the Master of Mankind was actively shaping reality rather than merely sustaining it. Navigator Lucinda Valerian felt the change as she guided a supply convoy through the warp near Mars. Her mechanical third eye detected new frequencies in the Astronomican's light, patterns of information that spoke of awakening purpose. The beacon that had served as humanity's guide for millennia was becoming something greater. A weapon forged in the crucible of ancient war. The Emperor remembers, she whispered to herself, watching as the Astronomican's light began to pulse in complex mathematical sequences. He remembers the first defeat, and he will not allow history to repeat itself. The revelation spread through the highest echelons of Imperial command like wildfire. Lord Commander Gilliman convened an emergency council that included not just the High Lords, but representatives from every major Imperial institution. The magnitude of what they faced required unity beyond anything the Imperium had achieved since the Great Crusade. "We are not the first human civilization," Guilliman declared, his Primarch intellect processing the implications with characteristic precision. "We are the second attempt, crafted by the sole survivor of humanity's first golden age. Every aspect of our society, from the Space Marines to the Navigator houses, represents lessons learned from that ancient defeat." Tech Dominus Zerath 9 returned from Pluto with Archaeotech secrets that strained even his enhanced cognition, added his mechanical voice to the discussion. "The weapons cache on Pluto is one of dozens scattered throughout the solar system. Each requires activation codes known only to the Emperor, and each represents a level of technological sophistication that makes our greatest achievements seem primitive." High Admiral Spire leaned forward, his veteran's instincts recognizing the tactical implications. "How long do we have before the Origin fleet arrives?" Navigator Lucinda, her augmented sight piercing veils of space and time, provided the answer that chilled every soul present. 3 months, perhaps less. The psychic bow wave precedes them by weeks, and entire sectors are already falling into madness. But there is something else. The fleet has begun to change course, adjusting its trajectory based on the Astronomican's new patterns. "It knows we are preparing," Valorous observed, his ancient features grim with understanding. "The intelligence guiding the swarm recognizes the activation of pre-war technologies. It remembers these weapons from the first conflict." The assembly fell silent as the true magnitude of their situation became clear. They faced not just an alien invasion, but the return of an enemy that had defeated humanity once before, using the same strategies and possessing intimate knowledge of their capabilities. Yet this time, humanity had advantages that their predecessors had lacked. "The Emperor endured," Guilliman said, his voice carrying a note of reverence that surprised even himself. "Through 10,000 years of agony, he preserved not just our species, but the knowledge needed to win this war. Every Space Marine chapter, every Navigator house, every institution of the Imperium represents a piece of his grand strategy." As if responding to his words, the chamber's Vox systems crackled to life with a transmission from Terra. The voice that emerged was not human, carrying harmonics that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. "My children," the Emperor's voice echoed through the chamber, distorted by 10 millennia of pain, yet unmistakably divine in its authority. "The time of preparation ends. The ancient enemy returns. But we are no longer the desperate remnants who fled their wrath eons ago. We are the inheritors of victory deferred, and our patience has been rewarded with understanding." The transmission continued, carrying instructions that would mobilize every world in the Imperium and activate weapons that had waited in darkness since before human civilization began. The Emperor's consciousness, expanded beyond mortal limits through 10,000 years of sacrifice, was finally ready to wage the war he had been preparing for since the first human looked up at the stars. In the depths of space beyond the galactic rim, the Tyranid origin fleet felt the change in its prey. The psychic beacon that had guided them across the void for so long was transforming, becoming something that sparked memories of ancient defeat in the hive mind's deepest consciousness. The swarm that had devoured 1,000 galaxies hesitated for the first time in eons, recognizing weapons and strategies from wars they had thought long forgotten. The final war was beginning, and this time, humanity would not face it as victims. They would meet their ancient enemy as the Emperor's chosen, armed with technologies forged in the crucible of the first defeat, and guided by the wisdom of the only being who remembered how to win. The shadow of the Origin fleet continued to spread across the galaxy, but now it was matched by a light that had been 10,000 years in the making. The real battle would be fought not just with weapons and warriors, but with the accumulated knowledge of humanity's greatest failure transformed into the foundation of their ultimate victory. Chapter 7. The First Contact. The screaming began at 0347 hours, Terran Standard Time, when the psychic bow wave of the Origin fleet reached the outer system of Ultramar. Navigator Antonius of House Belisarius was guiding the battle barge Macrage's Honor through a routine patrol when his augmented third eye detected something that should not have existed, a shadow in the warp that moved against the current of reality itself. The mechanical implant that had saved his sanity during the Emperor's great scream now blazed with warning signals as it processed data that strained even its enhanced capabilities. The approaching darkness was not merely psychic emanation, but active corruption, reaching across the void to poison the minds of every sensitive soul within a dozen light-years. "Lord Guilliman!" Antonius gasped into the Vox, his augmented systems struggling to filter the alien presence. "The enemy is here. Not physically, but their shadow precedes them. The warp itself recoils from their approach." On the command deck of his flagship, Lord Commander Guilliman felt the truth of those words in his Primarch soul. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent purpose, and he could taste the approaching horror on his superhuman senses. Around him, mortal crew members began to show signs of corruption, twitching limbs, bleeding eyes, and whispered words in languages that predated human civilization. "Battle stations," Guilliman commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Activate the Geller field generators and prepare the new weapon systems. If the ancient enemy wishes to announce its arrival, we shall provide a proper welcome. The weapons that emerged from hidden compartments throughout the Macragge's honor bore no resemblance to conventional Imperial armaments. Tech Marines who had installed them according to Archaeotech schematics from Terra could only guess at their function, yet as they powered to life, the oppressive psychic weight began to lift from the ship. The first shot fired in humanity's second war against the Great Devourer was not a shell or laser beam, but a pulse of crystallized reality that tore through the warp like a blade through shadow. Where it struck the approaching psychic corruption, the alien presence recoiled with something resembling pain. Across Ultramar, similar scenes played out as Guilliman's carefully prepared defenses activated for the first time. Space Marine battle barges and strike cruisers revealed weapons that had been dormant since the dark age of technology, their energy signatures unlike anything in the Mechanicus's sacred knowledge. Forge worlds that had labored for months to produce the Emperor's Archaeotech designs watched their creations perform beyond all expectation, yet the Origin fleet's response was swift and terrible. The psychic bow wave that had announced its approach suddenly intensified, becoming a focused assault on the minds of every human within Ultramar's borders. Entire worlds fell silent as their populations succumbed to alien madness, their screams echoing across the warp in harmonies that spoke of consumption and eternal hunger. Navigator Lucinda Valerian, now serving aboard the flagship Eternal Vigilance in the Sol Defense Fleet, felt the distant agony of her kindred as they fought to maintain their sanity against the psychic storm. Her mechanical third eye processed the data with clinical precision, yet even its enhanced filters could not completely shield her from the horror of what she perceived. "The corruption spreads faster than we anticipated," she reported to Admiral Quarren, her augmented sight tracking the expanding zone of alien influence. "Worlds are falling to madness at the rate of dozens per day. If this continues, entire sectors will be lost before the physical fleet arrives." The Admiral's weathered features showed the strain of commanding humanity's greatest naval force in the face of an enemy that defied conventional strategy. "What do you recommend, Navigator? How do we fight something that attacks the mind itself?" The answer came not from Lucinda, but from the Eternal Vigilance's bridge, where golden light suddenly filled the command chamber. The Emperor's presence, channeled through the ship's modified Geller field generators, manifested with an intensity that drove mortal crew members to their knees in reverence and terror. "My children," the Emperor's voice resonated through every soul aboard, carrying harmonics that bypassed physical hearing. "The time for preparation has ended. The ancient weapons stir to life, but they require more than mere activation. They require sacrifice." The implications struck Lucinda with the force of revelation. The Archaeotech weapons were not simply advanced technology, but devices that drew their power from the life force of those who wielded them. Just as the Golden Throne sustained the Astronomican through the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, these weapons required a similar price. "I understand, my lord," she whispered, her augmented third eye blazing with sudden purpose. "The weapons hunger for psychic energy. They feed on the souls of their operators to achieve their impossible effects." Across the Imperium, the revelation spread through channels both sacred and profane. Space Marine librarians who had spent months learning to operate the Archaeotech weapons understood at last why their psychic abilities were required. Navigator houses that had undergone augmentation found their mechanical third eyes adapting to new functions, becoming conduits for power that transcended mere navigation. The first major engagement came at the world of Calth, where Ultramarines defending the orbital dockyards activated a weapon array that had been hidden beneath the planet's surface for millennia. The device, powered by the sacrifice of an entire company of librarians, reached across the void to strike at the psychic emanations preceding the Origin fleet. The effect was catastrophic and beautiful in equal measure. A lance of pure order pierced the chaotic darkness of the alien presence, and for a brief moment the psychic storm that had been spreading across Ultramar diminished. Yet the cost was evident to all who witnessed it. The librarians who had powered the weapon were reduced to ash, their life force completely consumed by the ancient technology. Captain Sicarius, veteran of countless battles, stood amid the smoking remains of his battle brothers and felt the weight of what victory would demand. "So this is the Emperor's gambit," he said to himself, his enhanced eyes tracking the fading energy signatures of the Archaeotech weapon. "We trade our souls for the power to wound gods." The message spread through the Imperium's command structure with grim understanding. The ancient weapons could damage and even repel the Origin fleet's psychic assault, but each activation required the ultimate sacrifice from those with psychic sensitivity. The war would not be won through superior tactics or greater firepower, but through the willingness of humanity's greatest heroes to burn themselves out in service to their species. On Terra, in the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's consciousness expanded to encompass the growing sacrifice. Each librarian, each navigator, each psyker who gave their life to power, the Archaeotech weapons added their strength to his own. The Golden Throne, designed to sustain one immortal consciousness, began to resonate with the souls of the willing dead. Tech Dominus Zerath 9, monitoring the throne room's readings from his sanctum on Mars, observed energy patterns that defied all understanding. The Emperor was not merely commanding the war, but absorbing the essence of those who died in his service, growing stronger with each sacrifice. "The master of mankind becomes something beyond our comprehension," Zerath 9 noted in his personal data logs. "Each soul that powers the ancient weapons joins his consciousness, adding their knowledge and determination to his own. We witness the birth of a god forged from the willing sacrifice of his children." Yet even as humanity's hidden weapons began to take their toll on the psychic storm, the Origin fleet itself drew closer. Long-range auger arrays detected massive distortions in space-time as the physical swarm translated from the void between galaxies into real space. The creatures within those bioships had fed on the essence of entire galactic civilizations, and their hunger had grown beyond all mortal understanding. Navigator Lucinda, her augmented sight piercing the veils of distance and dimension, was the first to see them clearly. The bioships of the Origin fleet were not merely alive but conscious, each one a fusion of consumed species, twisted into forms that defied natural law. At their heart sailed something that made her mechanical third eye weep tears of silver. A vessel the size of a moon, constructed from the living bodies of gods that the Tyranids had devoured in their eons of wandering. "They come," she whispered, her words carrying across the Vox networks of the Sol Defense Fleet. "The great devourer shows its true face at last, and at its heart sails the tomb of every species it has ever consumed." The first phase of the war was ending. The psychic skirmishing, the activation of ancient weapons, the sacrifice of heroes to wound an approaching enemy, all of this had been merely preparation. Now, as the Origin fleet's bioships began to appear on the edge of human space, the real battle would begin. The Emperor's consciousness, expanded by the souls of the willing dead, prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just humanity's survival, but the fate of every thinking species in the galaxy. The ancient weapons blazed to life across 1,000 worlds, powered by heroes who chose death over defeat. The second war between humanity and the Great Devourer was about to enter its final phase. Chapter 8. The Vanguard Arrives. The bioships materialized in the Vigilus system, like cancerous tumors erupting from the fabric of space itself. Each vessel, dwarfed Imperial battleships, their living hulls pulsing with malevolent intelligence, while acid-bright spores began to drift toward the inhabited worlds below. The vanguard of the Origin fleet had arrived, and with them came creatures that had not walked among the stars since humanity's first golden age. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars stood on the command deck of the Eternal Crusader, watching his Auspex displays struggle to process the alien geometries before him. His centuries of warfare had prepared him for many horrors, yet the sight of bioships constructed from the fused remains of entire species pushed even his iron will to its limits. "Emperor preserve us," whispered Chaplain Grimaldus, his skull helmet unable to conceal the awe in his voice. "Those vessels, they are built from the corpses of gods themselves." The largest of the bioships, a leviathan that stretched across several kilometers of space, bore features that hurt the mind to perceive directly. Wings that had once carried celestial beings through dimensions beyond mortal comprehension now served as sensor arrays for the Tyranid fleet. Bodies that had once channeled the power of creation itself had been twisted into weapons of consumption that could devour star systems. Helbrecht activated his Vox, broadcasting to every Imperial vessel in the system. "All ships prepare to engage. The enemy shows us the fate of those who fail to resist them. Let our defiance be worthy of the Emperor's sacrifice." The battle that followed would be remembered as the Vigilus martyrdom, though few would survive to tell its tale. The Black Templars struck first, their ancient weapons blazing with power, drawn from the life force of their librarians. Each shot that found its mark burned away sections of bioship hull, yet the cost was terrible to behold. Brother Librarian Mordrak felt his soul being consumed as he channeled energy through the Eternal Crusader's Archaeotech cannons. The weapon drew not just his psychic power, but his very essence, burning away memories and emotions to fuel its impossible effects. As his consciousness faded, he saw his final shot tear through the wing of a god corpse, and knew his sacrifice had meaning. Yet for every wound inflicted on the alien fleet, the bioships responded with horrors beyond imagination. Spores the size of drop pods began to impact on Vigilus Prime, each one carrying organisms that defied natural law. The creatures that emerged were fusions of every species the Origin fleet had consumed, bearing the combined hatred and hunger of 1,000,000 extinct civilizations. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, commanding the orbital defense platforms above Vigilus Prime, watched through his tactical displays as the first wave of bio-horrors made planetfall. The creatures moved with intelligence that surpassed even the most evolved Tyranid strains, adapting their tactics in real time as they encountered resistance. "These are not mere beasts," he voxed to his battle brothers manning the defense lines. "They carry the accumulated knowledge of every species they have devoured. Fight not just against their claws and teeth, but against the strategic minds of 1,000 dead civilizations." The ground war that erupted across Vigilus Prime became a nightmare of evolution, accelerated beyond mortal comprehension. Bio-horrors that fell to bolter-fire rose again, their wounds healing through cellular memories borrowed from species that had faced similar weapons eons ago. Others adapted to plasma fire by developing crystalline carapaces learned from silicon-based life forms, or grew psychic shields copied from races that had mastered the warp before humanity's first breath. Navigator Lucinda Valerian, aboard the Sol Defense Fleet's flagship as it raced toward Vigilus, felt the death screams of entire populations echoing through the warp. Her augmented third eye processed the horror with clinical precision, yet even mechanical filters could not completely shield her from the magnitude of what was occurring. "The creatures are not merely consuming the population," she reported to Admiral Quarren. "They are learning from them. Every death adds to their collective knowledge. Every consumed mind strengthens their strategic capabilities." The Admiral's face was grim as he processed the implications. "How long does Vigilus have?" "Hours," Lucinda replied, her augmented sight tracking the spreading zones of alien corruption. "Perhaps less. The bioships are not simply invading the system, but transforming it into a staging ground for the main fleet's arrival." As if summoned by her words, the space around Vigilus began to warp and twist as more bioships translated from the void. Yet these vessels were different from the vanguard, their hulls bearing the distinctive marks of Tyranid biotechnology, fused with something far older and more terrible. Tech Dominus Zerath 9, monitoring the battle from his sanctum on Mars, recognized the signatures immediately. "Impossible," he whispered through his Vox grill. "Those ships incorporate technology from the war in heaven itself. The Origin fleet has consumed not just organic species, but the synthetic races as well." The revelation struck the Imperial command structure like a physical blow. If the Origin fleet had devoured the ancient Necrons and Citan, their technological capabilities went beyond mere biological evolution. They possessed the combined knowledge of every major galactic civilization that had ever existed. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm the defenders, salvation came from an unexpected source. The Emperor's consciousness, expanded through the absorption of countless sacrificed souls, began to manifest directly on the battlefield of Vigilus Prime. Golden light erupted from the planet's surface, as ancient weapons buried beneath its crust activated for the first time in 60 million years. The devices had been placed there by the Old Ones themselves, hidden weapons from the war in heaven that only the Emperor's expanding consciousness could locate and control. The effect was immediate and devastating. Waves of pure order swept across the planet, disrupting the bio-horror's adaptive capabilities and forcing them back into their component forms. The fusion creatures that had seemed unstoppable began to dissolve as their borrowed abilities failed them. High Marshal Helbrecht felt the Emperor's presence like fire in his veins as the golden light washed over the Eternal Crusader. Around him, his battle brothers fell to their knees in reverence and terror as the master of mankind's consciousness touched their souls directly. "My sons!" The Emperor's voice resonated through every Imperial warrior in the system. "Bear witness to what we have become. No longer bound by mortal flesh, we are the sum of every soul willingly given in service to humanity's survival." The bioships of the Vanguard fleet began to retreat as the Emperor's power manifested with increasing intensity. Yet even as they fled, they carried with them samples and data gathered from their brief contact with humanity's defenders. The Origin fleet's hive mind now possessed intimate knowledge of the Empire's capabilities and weaknesses. Captain Lysander, standing amid the golden radiance that had saved Vigilus Prime, understood the true nature of their situation. "This was not a defeat for them," he said to his assembled battle brothers. "This was reconnaissance. They came to learn what we had become, and now they know." The implications were staggering. The Origin fleet had allowed its vanguard to be repelled, trading temporary defeat for invaluable intelligence. They now knew the extent of humanity's archaeotech weapons, the cost required to operate them, and most importantly, the nature of the Emperor's transformation. Navigator Lucinda, her augmented sight tracking the retreating bioships, perceived the truth with crystalline clarity. "They know he is no longer merely human," she whispered. "They understand that the Emperor has become something that can threaten even their ancient hunger." As the Vanguard fleet disappeared into the void beyond the galactic rim, carrying their precious intelligence back to the main swarm, a new phase of the war began. The preliminary skirmishes were over. The Origin fleet now knew what they truly faced, and humanity had learned the terrifying extent of their enemy's accumulated knowledge. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's consciousness continued to expand as more souls joined his eternal vigil. Each librarian who died powering the ancient weapons, each navigator who burned out their augmented third eye in service to the fleet, each psyker who willingly sacrificed themselves for the greater good, all became part of something that transcended mortal understanding. The golden light that had saved Vigilus was not merely the Emperor's power, but the collective will of humanity itself, focused through 10,000 years of sacrifice into a weapon that could wound gods. Yet even this might not be enough to stop what was coming. The Origin fleet's main body continued its approach from beyond the rim, now armed with complete knowledge of humanity's capabilities. The creatures within those bioships had devoured civilizations that made the current Imperium seem primitive by comparison. They had consumed the technology of the Necrons, the wisdom of the Eldar, and the raw power of species whose names were lost to time. The final battle would not be a clash of armies, but a confrontation between two forms of existence that had transcended their original natures. On one side, the collective hunger of every extinct civilization, channeled through bioships of impossible complexity. On the other, the focused will of humanity's greatest souls, unified through the Emperor's expanding consciousness. The war was entering its final phase, and only one form of transcendence would survive to inherit the galaxy. Chapter 9. The Final Gambit. The return of the vanguard fleet to the Origin swarm brought with it knowledge that would reshape the final phase of the war. Deep within the massive bioships that dwarfed entire star systems, hive minds that had consumed the collective wisdom of 1,000 galaxies processed the intelligence gathered from Vigilus. What they learned changed everything. The entity that had once been the emperor of mankind was no longer bound by the limitations of singular consciousness. The Vanguard's bioforms had witnessed something unprecedented, a human intelligence expanded beyond mortal comprehension through the willing sacrifice of countless souls. This was not the crude psychic domination they had encountered in other galaxies, but a form of transcendence that threatened their very existence. Within the primary swarm ship, a creature that had once been a god of creation before its consumption began to reshape the fleet's strategy. The bioforms that served as its voice carried harmonics stolen from species that had spoken in mathematics and sang in quantum frequencies. "The prey has evolved beyond recognition," it declared to the assembled hive minds. "The individual they call Emperor has become a singular consciousness commanding billions of souls. This is not a species to be consumed, but a rival predator to be eliminated." The implications rippled through the Origin fleet like a psychic shockwave. For the first time in eons, they faced not prey, but competition. The human species had produced something that could challenge their ancient dominion over the galaxy's life force. On Terra, the Golden Throne had transformed beyond all recognition. The ancient device that had sustained the Emperor's failing body for 10 millennia now pulsed with energies that bent reality around its crystalline core. Tech Dominus Xerath 9, monitoring the readings from his sanctum on Mars, observed power levels that exceeded theoretical maximums. "The throne no longer sustains a dying god," he recorded in his personal data logs. "It has become the focal point for something that transcends godhood itself. The master of mankind draws power, not from the sacrifice of psychers, but from the willing devotion of every soul that has ever served the Imperium." The truth was more magnificent and terrible than even the Tech Dominus could comprehend. The Emperor's consciousness had expanded to encompass not just the living, but the dead, reaching across 10 millennia of service to touch every soul that had died in humanity's name. The Space Marines who had fallen in the Great Crusade, the Guardsmen who had died holding the line against Xenos horrors, the civilians who had perished defending their worlds, all became part of a consciousness that spanned the entirety of human experience. Navigator Lucinda Valerian felt the change as she guided the Sol Defense Fleet through the final preparations for battle. Her augmented third eye, designed to filter the Emperor's pain, now struggled to process the sheer magnitude of what he had become. The Astronomican no longer merely guided ships through the warp. It had become a beacon of pure human will that blazed across dimensions. "He is calling to every human soul in the galaxy," she whispered to Admiral Quarren, as her mechanical implant sparked with overload warnings. "Not just the living, but the dead as well. 10,000 years of sacrifice are awakening to serve in this final battle." The mobilization that followed dwarfed even the Great Crusade in its scope and ambition. From every corner of the Imperium, fleets converged on Terra carrying warriors, weapons, and technologies that had been hidden since humanity's first Golden Age. The Custodian Guard emerged from the deepest vaults, carrying arms that had not seen battle since the war in heaven. Space Marine chapters arrived, bearing archaeotech weapons that their tech marines barely understood, but wielded with absolute faith. Yet it was not merely the living who answered the Emperor's call. Across the galaxy, reports poured in of phenomena that defied rational explanation. On battlefields where heroes had fallen, spectral figures began to appear, fighting alongside their living descendants with weapons of pure will. Ships that had been destroyed in glorious last stands materialized in Imperial fleets, their hulls gleaming with ethereal light as their crews served beyond death itself. Captain General Valoris stood before the assembled custodians in the throne room, his golden armor reflecting the impossible energies that now surrounded the Emperor's transformed form. The master of mankind no longer appeared as a corpse sustained by ancient machinery, but as a figure of such radiance that even the custodian's enhanced vision struggled to perceive him directly. 10,000 years of preparation end now. The Emperor's voice resonated, not through air, but directly through the souls of every being present. We have become what our ancient enemy fears most, a species united not through domination, but through willing sacrifice. They devour civilizations to add their strength to their own. We choose to give our strength freely, and in that choice lies the power to destroy them. The final revelation came from Navigator Lucinda as she observed the approaching Origin fleet through her augmented sight. The massive bioships had begun to change course, no longer heading directly for Terra, but dispersing throughout the galaxy in a pattern that spoke of desperate strategy rather than confident predation. "They're not coming to consume us," she reported to the High Lords assembled in emergency session. "They're trying to flee. The main fleet recognizes what the Emperor has become and seeks to escape before he can focus his full attention upon them." Lord Commander Gilliman, his Primarch intellect processing the tactical implications, understood immediately. Then we must not allow them to scatter. If they disperse throughout the galaxy, they could consume entire sectors while avoiding direct confrontation. We need to force them into a single decisive battle. The strategy that emerged from the Emergency Council was audacious beyond measure. Rather than defend Terra and wait for the enemy to attack, the Imperium would launch a preemptive strike designed to draw the entire Origin fleet into a confrontation they could not escape. The Emperor himself would lead the assault, his consciousness expanded beyond mortal limits, serving as both weapon and shield for humanity's greatest gamble. Tech Dominus Zerath 9 observed the preparations with a mixture of awe and terror. Ancient weapon systems that had slumbered since before the birth of human civilization were being activated throughout the Sol system. The very planets themselves were being transformed into weapons, their cores replaced with archaeotech devices that could channel the Emperor's transcendent will across light years of space. "We witness the birth of a god weapon," Zerath 9 recorded, as Mars itself began to pulse with golden light. "The Emperor has become more than the sum of human souls. He is the focused will of an entire species, concentrated into a single moment of absolute determination." The Origin fleet's response was swift and desperate. Bioships that had devoured entire star systems began to converge on the edge of the Sol system, their living hulls pulsing with the combined malevolence of every extinct civilization they had consumed. At their heart sailed the primary swarm ship, a construct of such size and malevolence that its presence bent space-time around its massive bulk. Navigator Lucinda, her augmented sight piercing the veils of distance and dimension, was the first to perceive the true magnitude of what approached. The primary swarm ship was not merely large, it was a living galaxy unto itself, its body constructed from the fused remains of every Dyson sphere, every ring world, every megastructure that the Origin fleet had ever encountered. "Emperor, preserve us," she whispered, as her mechanical third eye wept tears of liquid silver. "They have not merely consumed species and civilizations, they have consumed the works of gods themselves." Yet even as the full scope of the enemy's power became clear, the Emperor's response was equally magnificent. The Golden Throne erupted with light that transcended the visible spectrum, reaching across dimensions to touch every human soul that had ever lived. The boundary between life and death dissolved as 10 millennia of the faithful dead answered their master's call. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of consciousness itself in the galaxy. On one side stood the accumulated hunger of every extinct civilization, focused through biotechnology that transcended natural law. On the other stood the willing sacrifice of an entire species, channeled through a being who had transcended godhood itself. The final battle was about to begin, and only one form of transcendence would survive to inherit the stars. Chapter 10. The Final War. The battle began not with the roar of engines or the thunder of guns, but with silence so profound that reality itself seemed to hold its breath. At the edge of the Sol system, where the outer planets traced their ancient orbits, two forms of transcendence prepared to test which vision of existence would survive to inherit the galaxy. The Emperor rose from the Golden Throne for the first time in 10 millennia, his form no longer that of a corpse sustained by machinery, but a being of pure light that hurt the mind to perceive directly. Around him, the souls of every human who had ever died in service to the species manifested as an army of spectral warriors stretching beyond the horizon. They were the fallen of 10,000 years of war, united at last in purpose that transcended death itself. Navigator Lucinda Valerian, her augmented third eye blazing with overload warnings, watched from the bridge of the flagship Eternal Vigilance as the Emperor's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire Sol system. Each planet became a focal point for his transcendent will, their cores replaced with archaeotech weapons that pulsed with golden radiance. "He has become what he always intended to be," she whispered to Admiral Quarren, her voice filled with awe and terror. "Not just the protector of humanity, but the very essence of human will made manifest." The Origin Fleet's response was immediate and terrible. The primary swarm ship, that living galaxy constructed from the consumed remains of countless civilizations, began to unfold like a malevolent flower. Bioships the size of solar systems detached from its bulk, each one carrying weapons that had devoured star clusters and consciousness, devouring parasites that could corrupt entire species with a thought. At the fleet's heart, the entity that had once been a god of creation, before its consumption by the Tyranids, spoke with voices stolen from 1,000,000 extinct races. "You have become worthy prey at last," it declared across frequencies that bypassed physical reality. "Your transcendence will make our victory all the more satisfying." The first exchange of fire lit up the void with energies that had not been unleashed since the war in heaven itself. The Emperor's archaeotech weapons, powered by the willing sacrifice of humanity's greatest heroes, struck out across light years to pierce the bioship's living hulls. Where the golden beams touched alien flesh, entire sections of the massive vessels simply ceased to exist, their matter converted to pure information that flowed back to strengthen the Emperor's growing consciousness. Yet the Origin Fleet's counterattack was equally devastating. Weapons that had consumed the firepower of entire Necron dynasties lashed out at the Sol system's defenders, their alien energies seeking to corrupt rather than destroy. Where they struck Imperial ships, the vessels began to transform, their loyal crews screaming as their bodies and souls were twisted into extensions of the hive mind's will. Captain General Valoris led the Custodian Guard in a charge that defied every law of physics, their golden armor allowing them to stride across the void as if it were solid ground. Around them, the spectral armies of humanity's dead fought alongside the living, their weapons forged from pure determination rather than metal and energy. "For the master of mankind," Valoris roared as his guardian spear carved through bio-horrors that had devoured entire star systems. "For every soul that has ever served, for the future of consciousness itself. The battle raged across dimensions as well as space, with the Emperor's transcendent consciousness grappling directly with the collective hive mind of the Origin fleet. In the spaces between thoughts, where reality became malleable, two incompatible visions of existence fought for dominance. The Emperor's vision was one of willing sacrifice, of individual souls choosing to unite for something greater than themselves while retaining their essential humanity. The Origin fleet's counter-vision was one of forced unity, of consciousness consumed and absorbed until nothing remained but an ever-growing hunger that devoured meaning itself. Tech Dominus Zerath 9, monitoring the battle from his sanctum on Mars, observed reality fluctuations that exceeded all theoretical possibilities. The fabric of space-time itself has become a battlefield, he recorded, as his instruments struggled to process the impossible data. We witness not merely a war between species, but a conflict between two fundamental concepts of what existence should be. The tide of battle shifted moment by moment, as both sides committed reserves that spanned eons of preparation. The Origin fleet deployed bioconstructs grown from the essence of extinct galactic civilizations, each one carrying the accumulated hatred of species that had been devoured across countless ages. Against them, the Emperor unleashed weapons that had been hidden since before human civilization began, devices that channeled the creative force of the universe itself into tools of absolute destruction. Navigator Lucinda felt her augmented third eye begin to fail, as the psychic energies involved in the battle exceeded even mechanical tolerances. Through her fading vision, she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her existence. The moment when the Emperor's consciousness touched that of the Origin fleet's primary hive mind directly. The collision of two transcendent intelligences sent shockwaves through every dimension simultaneously. On 1,000 worlds, psychers fell to their knees as reality itself groaned under the strain. In the depths of the warp, even the Chaos Gods paused their eternal games to observe the confrontation between forces that dwarfed their own power. For one eternal instant, the Emperor experienced the collective memory of every species the Origin fleet had ever consumed. He felt their terror, their desperation, their final moments of existence as they were absorbed into something that cared nothing for their individual dreams and fears. The weight of genocide spanning millions of years threatened to crush even his transcendent consciousness. Yet in that same moment, the Origin fleet's hive mind experienced something it had never encountered in eons of existence: the willing sacrifice of souls who chose their fate freely. The concept was so alien to its nature that it recoiled like a living thing touched by flame. "You do not understand," the Emperor's voice resonated across every frequency of existence. "They chose this. Every soul that stands with me chose to give their existence freely. That is what makes us more than the sum of our parts." The primary swarm ship began to convulse as the alien concept of willing sacrifice spread through its bio-neural networks like a virus. Creatures that had been absorbed against their will began to remember what they had lost, their residual consciousness stirring for the first time since their consumption. High Marshal Helbrecht, leading the Black Templars in boarding actions against bioships the size of continents, felt the change as alien creatures began to turn against their own fleet. "The enemy's slaves remember freedom," he voxed to his battle brothers. "The Emperor's light awakens what they thought destroyed forever." The Origin fleet's response was one of pure desperation. Unable to comprehend willing sacrifice, the hive mind began to consume its own bioships in a futile attempt to purge the alien concept from its consciousness. The primary swarm ship turned its weapons on its own fleet, destroying eons of accumulated biomass rather than allow the idea of choice to spread further. Yet even this desperate gambit could not stop what had been set in motion. The Emperor's consciousness expanded through the willing sacrifice of every human soul that had ever served, began to resonate with the enslaved essence of every species the Origin fleet had ever consumed. For the first time in their existence, the devoured dead found their voices again. The rebellion that followed was not a war between species, but an uprising of consciousness itself. Every extinct civilization that had been absorbed into the Origin fleet's biomass began to assert their individual identity, their unique perspective on existence. The hive mind that had grown fat on forced unity found itself torn apart by the very diversity it had sought to eliminate. Captain Sicarius of the Ultramarines, fighting in the depths of a bioship that had once been a living planet, witnessed the impossible. Alien creatures that had served the hive mind for millions of years were turning against their masters, their original personalities emerging from eons of suppression. This is not victory through conquest, he realized, as he watched a creature that had once been part of an aquatic civilization help him fight against tyrannid bioforms. This is liberation through remembrance. The Emperor has not destroyed our enemies. He has reminded them who they used to be. The primary swarm ship, faced with the complete collapse of its internal unity, made one final desperate gambit. Drawing upon every scrap of power it had accumulated across eons of consumption, it began to collapse in on itself, creating a singularity that would consume the entire Sol system rather than face defeat. Yet even this ultimate act of spite was denied to it. The Emperor, his consciousness now encompassing not just humanity, but every liberated soul that had been enslaved by the Origin fleet, reached out with power that transcended physical law. Where the swarm ship sought to create destruction, he imposed creation. Where it sought to devour, he chose to preserve. The singularity that should have consumed everything instead became a gateway, opening pathways to dimensions where the enslaved civilizations could rebuild what they had lost. One by one, the liberated souls began to depart, carrying with them the restored essence of their extinct species and the promise of new existence in realms beyond the physical universe. Navigator Lucinda, her failing sight barely able to process what she witnessed, watched as the greatest enemy humanity had ever faced dissolved not in conquest, but in redemption. The Origin fleet's bioships crumbled as their enslaved components chose freedom over forced unity, their constituent souls departing for dimensions where they could exist as they had always meant to be. In the aftermath of transcendence, only two forces remained in the void where the battle had raged. The Emperor, his consciousness expanded beyond all mortal understanding, and the remnants of a species that had learned the true meaning of choice. The war was over, but its consequences would reshape the very nature of existence itself. Chapter 11. The Price of Transcendence. In the aftermath of transcendence, the Sol system bore little resemblance to the realm that had birthed humanity's greatest empire. Where planets had once traced their ancient orbits, crystalline structures of impossible geometry now hung in the void, their surfaces pulsing with energies that existed beyond the visible spectrum. The Emperor had not merely won the final battle, he had fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself within his domain. Navigator Lucinda Valerian stood on the observation deck of the Eternal Vigilance, her augmented third eye finally dark after burning out during the cosmic confrontation. Through organic sight alone, she watched as terror itself transformed before her eyes. The Golden Throne had expanded beyond the Imperial Palace, its crystalline matrix now encompassing the entire planet in a web of light that connected every human soul to the Emperor's transcendent consciousness. "What have we become?" she whispered to Admiral Quarren, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the birth of godhood itself. "Are we still human, or have we evolved into something else entirely?" The Admiral had no answer, for he too struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their transformation. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out as Imperial commanders grappled with a victory that had cost them their very understanding of existence. They had saved humanity by transcending it, and the implications of that paradox would haunt them for generations to come. On Mars, Tech Dominus Zerath 9 observed readings that exceeded every theoretical framework the Mechanicus had ever developed. The Omnissiah that his order had worshipped in theory had manifested in reality, but the divine machine god bore little resemblance to the cold logic they had expected. Instead, the Emperor's expanded consciousness pulsed with the warm complexity of every human emotion, every individual choice, every act of willing sacrifice that had contributed to his ascension. "The flesh is weak, but the spirit is eternal," Zerath 9 recorded in his final data log entry. "We sought to replace humanity with perfected machinery, yet the master of mankind has shown us that perfection lies not in the elimination of weakness, but in the choice to transcend it through unity of purpose." The cost of victory became apparent as the surviving Imperial forces took stock of their losses. Entire Space Marine chapters had been consumed by the Archaeotech weapons, their battle brothers choosing to burn out their life force rather than see humanity fall to an ancient enemy. The Navigator houses that had guided the Imperium for 10 millennia were reduced to a handful of survivors, their bloodlines forever changed by the augmentations that had allowed them to function in the final crisis. Captain General Valoris found himself the leader of a custodian guard that existed in a state beyond life and death. His golden warriors had been touched by the Emperor's transcendent light during the final battle. Their consciousness expanded beyond mortal limits, while their bodies remained anchored in physical reality. They were guardians still, but guardians of something that no longer required protection in any conventional sense. "We are the bridge between what humanity was and what it has become," he explained to High Lord Militant Constantin Valdor during their first meeting after the battle. "Our duty remains unchanged, though the nature of that duty has evolved beyond our original understanding." The transformation extended beyond the Sol system to every corner of the Imperium. Worlds that had contributed psychers to the Emperor's cause found themselves changed, their populations developing abilities that transcended the traditional understanding of psychic talent. These were not the dangerous mutations that the Imperium had feared for millennia, but controlled evolutions that allowed ordinary humans to participate in the Emperor's expanded consciousness without losing their individual identity. Lord Commander Guilliman, his Primarch intellect struggling to process the new reality, convened what would be the final meeting of the High Lords in their traditional form. The governing body that had ruled the Imperium for 10 millennia found itself obsolete, for their Emperor no longer required intermediaries to express his will to his people. "We have achieved the impossible," Guilliman declared to the assembled lords. "We have united humanity, not through conquest or coercion, but through the willing sacrifice of our greatest heroes. Yet in achieving this unity, we have fundamentally altered what it means to be human." The philosophical implications were staggering. Humanity had evolved beyond its biological origins, not through genetic manipulation or technological augmentation, but through the pure force of collective will focused through the Emperor's transcendent consciousness. They remained recognizably human in their thoughts and emotions, yet they were connected to something greater than themselves in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. High Admiral Spire, commanding what remained of the Imperial Navy, faced the reality that his fleets were no longer necessary for the defense of humanity. The warp itself had been calmed by the Emperor's presence, its chaotic currents now flowing in patterns that reflected divine will rather than the random malevolence of chaos. Ships could travel between stars guided by pure intention rather than requiring the specialized skills of navigators. "The age of warfare is ending," he confided to his bridge crew as they observed the transformed landscape of the galaxy. "We are no longer a species that must fight for survival. We have become something that creates rather than destroys, something that builds rather than conquers." Yet not all of humanity's children embraced the transformation with equal enthusiasm. On distant worlds at the galaxy's edge, populations that had been isolated from the final battle struggled to understand what had occurred. Some viewed the Emperor's transcendence as the ultimate fulfillment of their faith, while others feared that they had lost their god to something beyond mortal comprehension. Tech Adept Kane, monitoring communications from these distant worlds, recorded the first stirrings of a new kind of religious schism. The faithful are divided between those who celebrate the Emperor's evolution and those who mourn the loss of his humanity, he noted. We may have prevented the galaxy's destruction, but we have also created questions that will define our species for millennia to come. The most profound change was felt by those who had direct experience of the Emperor's expanded consciousness. Navigator Lucinda, despite her burned-out augmentations, found herself still connected to the transcendent light that had saved humanity. In quiet moments, she could sense the presence of every human soul that had ever lived, their experiences and wisdom available to anyone willing to open their consciousness to the greater unity. He has not absorbed us, she realized during a meditation session in the ship's chapel. He has connected us. We remain ourselves, but we are no longer alone. Every human who has ever lived stands ready to offer their knowledge and support to those who need it. This revelation transformed the very nature of human society. Death became not an ending, but a transition to a different form of service, as the consciousness of the departed remained available to guide and support the living. Knowledge was no longer lost with the passing of its holders, but became part of a vast collective memory that enhanced rather than replaced individual thought. Captain Sicarius, reflecting on his experiences during the final battle, understood that humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. We have become a species that grows stronger through diversity rather than uniformity, he observed. Each individual consciousness adds something unique to the whole, making us greater than any force that seeks to impose singular will upon the galaxy. Yet questions remained about the future of a species that had transcended its original limitations. The Imperium, as it had existed for 10 millennia, was ending, replaced by something that had no precedent in galactic history. Humanity had become both individual and collective, mortal and eternal, human and divine. In the crystalline structures that had replaced the Golden Throne, the Emperor's consciousness contemplated the magnitude of what he had wrought. The species he had guided for 10,000 years had finally achieved the unity he had always envisioned, but at a cost that even his foresight had not fully anticipated. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer hopeless. Humanity had survived its greatest trial, not by becoming something other than human, but by becoming more human than they had ever been before. The willing sacrifice of countless souls had created not a god-emperor ruling over subjects, but a unity of consciousness that preserved individual identity while transcending the limitations that had bound them to a single world, a single form, a single understanding of what existence could be. The war was over, but the real journey of human evolution was just beginning. Chapter 12. What we have become. A year had passed since the Emperor's transcendence, yet time itself seemed to flow differently in the transformed galaxy. Navigator Lucinda Valerian stood in what had once been the Navigator's chapel aboard the Eternal Vigilance, watching as golden light filtered through crystalline windows that had grown from the ship's hull like living coral. Her augmented third eye had never been replaced, for she no longer needed mechanical enhancement to perceive the currents of the warp. The Astronomican still blazed across the galaxy, but its nature had changed beyond recognition. No longer the tortured beacon of a dying god sustained by daily sacrifice, it had become something that hurt to comprehend, a lighthouse of pure consciousness that guided not just ships, but souls themselves toward their highest potential. Every human who looked upon its light could feel the presence of their ancestors, their wisdom and love flowing across the void to offer guidance to the living. "We achieved what we set out to do," Admiral Quarren said, as he joined her at the observation port. His weathered features bore the same expression of quiet wonder that had marked every human who had witnessed the transformation. We saved our species from extinction. Yet I find myself wondering if the price we paid was worth what we gained. Lucinda nodded, her organic sight tracking the distant glow of Terra, where the Emperor's consciousness had fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself. "We are no longer the species that looked up at the stars and dreamed of conquest," she replied. "We have become something that looks inward and dreams of understanding. Whether that represents victory or loss may depend on perspectives we have not yet learned to hold." Across the galaxy, similar scenes of quiet contemplation played out as humanity grappled with its new existence. On forge worlds that had once echoed with the thunder of weapons production, tech adepts now crafted devices whose purpose transcended mere functionality. Their creations were works of art that bridged the gap between machine logic and human emotion, tools that enhanced consciousness rather than replacing it. Captain Sicarius walked through the memorial gardens that had replaced the weapon-testing grounds on Macraga, his enhanced senses perceiving the subtle harmonics that flowed through every living thing. The Ultramarines had evolved beyond their role as warriors, becoming guides and teachers who helped other humans navigate the complexities of expanded consciousness. Their gene seed now carried not just the capacity for physical enhancement, but the ability to access the collective wisdom of every space marine who had ever served. "We were created to be weapons in the Emperor's grand design," he reflected, as he paused before a monument to fallen battle brothers. "Yet we have become instruments of a different kind, tools for building rather than destroying, for connecting rather than conquering." The transformation had not been uniform across all of humanity. On distant frontier worlds, populations struggled to understand what had occurred in the galaxy's heart. Some embraced the change, opening their consciousness to the transcendent light that offered connection to something greater than themselves. Others resisted, clinging to older understandings of what it meant to be human in a universe that seemed increasingly alien to their experience. Tech Dominus Izerath 9, his consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of his mechanical form, monitored these distant worlds with something approaching paternal concern. The Omnisire he had worshipped for centuries had become real, but the divine machine god bore little resemblance to the cold perfection his order had expected. Instead, the Emperor's transcendent consciousness pulsed with the warm complexity of every human emotion, every individual choice, every act of love and sacrifice that had contributed to his evolution. "Perfection," he recorded in his final theological treatise, "is not the elimination of weakness, but the integration of all aspects of existence into a harmonious whole." We sought to replace the flesh with the certainty of the machine, yet the master of mankind has shown us that true strength lies in the willing embrace of both flesh and spirit, logic and emotion, individual desire and collective purpose. The most profound changes were felt by those who had been closest to the Emperor's original vision. Captain General Valoris and his custodian guard found themselves guardians of something that no longer required protection in any conventional sense. Their golden armor had been touched by transcendent light during the final battle, transforming them into beings that existed simultaneously in physical reality and the realm of pure consciousness. "We guard not a throne, but an idea," Valoris explained to the newest inductees into the Guard, young humans whose consciousness had been expanded from birth to encompass both individual identity and collective awareness. "We protect not a person, but the principle of willing unity that allows our species to grow beyond its original limitations while retaining what makes us human." Lord Commander Guilliman had dissolved the High Lords of Terra, for their intermediary role between Emperor and people had become obsolete. Yet he remained, not as a ruler, but as a teacher, helping other humans understand what they had become. His Primarch intellect struggled daily with questions that had no easy answers. Had humanity evolved or simply changed? Were they still the species that had looked up at the stars with wonder, or had they become something else, entirely. "We are the children of our choices," he declared, during what would be remembered as the final imperial address. 10,000 years of sacrifice, 10 million acts of willing service, countless souls who chose to give rather than take. All of this has culminated in our current existence. We are human, not because of our biology, but because of our capacity to choose love over hate, unity over division, creation over destruction. The galaxy itself bore witness to humanity's transformation. Worlds that had been scarred by millennia of warfare began to bloom with new life, their ecosystems restored by technologies that worked in harmony with natural processes rather than dominating them. The warp, once a realm of chaos and madness, flowed with currents that reflected the ordered harmony of consciousness united in common purpose. Yet questions remained that even the Emperor's expanded consciousness couldn't answer. What would become of a species that had transcended the limitations of individual existence while retaining individual identity? How would they interact with other sentient races who had not undergone similar evolution? What responsibilities did transcendence bring, and what dangers might arise from power beyond mortal understanding? Navigator Lucinda found herself contemplating these questions as she prepared for what might be her final journey through the warp. The Eternal Vigilance had been tasked with carrying word of humanity's transformation to the galaxy's edge, where isolated human colonies waited in ignorance of what had occurred. It would be dangerous work, for not all of humanity's children would welcome news of their species' evolution. "Some will see us as saviors," she told Admiral Quarren as they prepared for departure. "Others will view us as the destroyers of everything they held sacred. Both may be correct, for transformation always carries the seeds of both creation and destruction." As their ship entered the warp for the first time since the Emperor's transcendence, Lucinda felt the presence of every navigator who had ever served, their consciousness accessible but not overwhelming. She was still herself, still the woman who had first felt the Emperor's scream in the darkness, yet she was also part of something greater that encompassed the entire history of human space travel. In the depths of what had once been the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's consciousness contemplated the magnitude of what humanity had achieved. They were no longer the desperate species that had fled Terra millennia ago, seeking to impose their will upon an indifferent universe. They had become something that sought to understand rather than conquer, to connect rather than dominate. Yet even transcendence carried its own burdens. The power to reshape reality brought with it the responsibility to use that power wisely. The ability to access the collective knowledge of every human who had ever lived created obligations to those who had made such knowledge possible through their sacrifice. The future stretched ahead, vast and uncertain. Humanity had evolved beyond their biological origins, but evolution was not a destination. It was an endless journey of becoming. Each generation would face new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to grow beyond their current understanding. Other species would rise and fall, new threats would emerge from the darkness between stars, and the cosmos itself would continue its ancient dance of creation and destruction. Yet humanity would meet these challenges not as isolated individuals struggling for survival, but as a unified consciousness that retained the precious gift of individual perspective. The war against the Origin fleet had ended not in conquest, but in redemption, proving that the universe's greatest battles were fought not between species, but between different visions of what existence should be. Humanity had chosen a vision of willing unity over forced conformity, of growth through diversity rather than strength through uniformity. The Emperor's scream, which had begun this transformation 30 seconds of darkness ago, had become a song that echoed across dimensions. It spoke of sacrifice willingly given, of love that transcended death, of hope that survived even the heat death of stars. It was a song that would guide humanity through whatever challenges the future might bring. The Astronomican blazed on, no longer a beacon of desperate endurance, but a lighthouse of infinite possibility. Humanity had learned to dream not just of survival, but of what they might become when survival was no longer in question. They had discovered that transcendence was not about leaving humanity behind, but about becoming more human than they had ever imagined possible. In the end, the greatest victory was not the defeat of an ancient enemy, but the realization that consciousness itself was the most precious gift in the universe, a gift that grew stronger when shared, more beautiful when diverse, and more meaningful when freely given in service to something greater than individual desire. The war was over, but the real journey of human evolution had only just begun.